again. In the last class, we were talking about a number of different topics: culture, cultural studies, the history of cultural ideas and ways to think about Latin America. And we were also talking about the history of Central America, which is an important region for a variety of reasons, but also a region that doesn't get as much attention as other parts of Latin America do. And I would like to continue today, I would like to start today by continuing to talk about the history of Central America, and in particular, the history of Guatemala in the 19th and 20th centuries. Actually, my main topic for today is going to be gender roles and the history of indigenous or native women. One of the groups of women that I will talk about is the Maya, and the Maya make up over half the population of Guatemala. And I want to tie some of what I have to say about the history of Guatemala to the history of indigenous women. We will also hear in the second part of class today about a very important aspect of culture and cultural history in Latin America, and that is the history of religion, the history of the Catholic Church, of course, but also we will hear about the story of religious change in Latin America. So let me go ahead and get started by talking about Guatemala and the new nations of Central America, which is where I had finished last week. And one of the points I had made as I was finishing up was that after Central America became independent, and in a sense it became independent twice, because it became independent from Spain as part of Mexico, and then it became independent from Mexico, but the liberal plans to unify the region failed because the area, while what became the countries of Central America do have certain similarities to each other, there also were and are enough differences so that unification was simply not a practical project in terms of nation building. So what happened in the early 19th century, in the late 1830s to be exact, was that liberal plans for unification had failed. And in Guatemala, which was and is the largest and economically most powerful country of the region in certain ways, I think by virtue of its larger population, in Guatemala, a strongman conservative dictator, in other words, a caudillo named Rafael Carrera, emerged. And Carrera dominated Guatemalan and Central American political life from the late 1830s until 1865, when he died. He had no formal education. He did, however, have great strength of character, some would say even to the point of being not only ruthless, but extremely ruthless, and that allowed him to dominate Guatemala's political life until 1865. And that's the year that he died. He was typically conservative in ideology. We spent some time last week talking about the difference between conservative and liberal ideologies, so that I hope that is pretty clear at this point. He was typically conservative, as I said, and he restored the role of the church, and he developed political and social systems that were quite colonial in nature. He held the title of president. There was a legislature, but this was largely a sort of fiction, or perhaps it's better to say that it was largely a formality. He ruled as a dictator, and Carrera, was very dictatorial. The liberal effort to assimilate the indigenous population was abandoned, and colonial labor systems were maintained. The Indian, largely Maya population remained a separate and segregated group, And that had very major implications for the nature of society and politics in Guatemala, as you will see. The most important implication that it had was that while there was some racial and ethnic mixing, as took place in other parts of Latin America, most especially in Mexico, which by the late 19th century thought of itself as a mestizo nation. That did not happen in Guatemala. Guatemala had a larger indigenous population than elsewhere in Latin America. Indians remained, as I said, separate and segregated, but it really wasn't just that they were separate and segregated. They were truly a secondary class, treated as laborers, treated as peons. They were extremely poor. In a poor country, many were the poorest of the poor. And in a lot of ways, this situation remains true to this day. Not that there haven't been certain kinds of political changes, and I will talk about that. Carrera imposed conservative leaders elsewhere in Central America, yet liberal ideology and supporters of liberalism did not completely disappear. And this led to one of the stranger events of 19th century Central American history, that is the intervention of one William Walker in mid-19th century Nicaragua. Both Central Americans and others had long dreamed of a canal that would connect the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. And in the mid-19th century, the best possibility for such a canal, and of course you all know that this dream would eventually lead to the building of the Panama Canal. But in the mid-19th century, the best possibility seemed likely to be Nicaragua, in part because of its geographic location and in part because the U.S. had achieved a high level of, how shall I put this, influence. That's a good word. The U.S. had achieved a high level of influence over the Nicaraguan government. And American business owners had a lot of ties to wealthy Nicaraguans. Some of these wealthy Nicaraguans were liberals. They turned to the U.S. for help in trying to bring about the canal project, and some of that help came from William Walker, an intelligent, fast-talking Tennessean who, with Nicaraguan money, hired an army and invaded Nicaragua in 1855. Quickly victorious, however, his real interest became apparent, because his real interest wasn't so much the canal as it was becoming an authoritarian Central American dictator. And he became head of Nicaragua's military and became the country's authoritarian ruler. Conservatives in other Central American states, as well as the British, who also had important business interests in the region, quickly declared their opposition, and they drove Walker from power in 1857, and in 1860 he was killed as he tried to return. This had many consequences for Nicaraguan history, because liberals were discredited within Nicaragua because of this set of events. And Nicaragua's politics then remained conservative well into the 20th century. Elsewhere, however, in Central America by the 1870s, liberal politicians again dominated. And they supported, as I talked about last week, they supported ideas of economic development and progress. They wanted to try to integrate the region's economies, not only with each other, but more importantly, they wanted to integrate the region's economies into the global economic system as it was at that time. They wanted to appear civilized. They believed in education, and they tried to promote material improvement. Modernizing government and the military and stripping the church, the Catholic Church, of power were all policies of the late 19th century Central American liberal governments. The power of liberal governments led to two very important economic changes in Central America. And that is that two agricultural commodities, which already had been grown, but two agricultural commodities became extremely important. They became the dominant commodities in several countries, and they became so dominant that they had a major impact. One could even say a controlling impact on the economics and politics of Central America, and these commodities, of course, are coffee and bananas. By 1880, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras were important exporters of coffee. Central America today remains an important exporter today. Starbucks, for example, features some Central American coffees. At this point, Central American coffees do not represent more than about 15% of the total world supply. But within Guatemala and Central America, coffee remains a major export, and Central American coffees are considered to be of very high quality. What did and does such specialization mean? We've talked about the consequences of economic specialization. Professor Kugler certainly addressed that issue. And she gave a number of examples, but she did so in a somewhat general way. Let me talk in relation to coffee and bananas about the consequences of specialization. They are pretty striking. In Guatemala and El Salvador, growing coffee on plantations meant land expropriations. What that means is there's a reordering of the relationship between peasant communities and large landowners and the state. That is, the national government. What happens is that coffee growing plantations and plantation owners expropriated lands where they couldn't get land through buying. They found a number of different legal and what we might call extra-legal means to get the land that they needed for plantations to be the size that they need to make the economics of coffee production work. And in both places, land was taken from peasant communities that were Ladino, and I want to talk about the word Ladino in a minute. Land was taken from peasant communities that were Ladino and peasant communities that were indigenous. It is important to ask, what is a Ladino? Ladino is a concept that is used throughout Central America, particularly in Guatemala, to describe someone of mixed race who spoke or speaks Spanish and who identifies with Guatemalan national culture. The concept of Ladino is quite similar, of course, to the concept of mestizo in Mexico. But if you think about the words, and I do have to admit that I don't know the exact etymology of Ladino, but I think we can be pretty sure that it is from Spanish and its roots are Latin. And what it communicates is that in the process of racial and cultural mixing, what is emphasized in Central America and in Guatemala is the Spanish side of the equation, the Spanish side of the ethnic mixing. In Mexico, the word mestizo, also a Spanish word, the word mestizo, however, refers to the act of mixing. So the emphasis in the two words is somewhat different, and that usage of language is telling us something about the concept of racial and ethnic identity in the two different countries. And it is pretty interesting because they are right next to each other. There are some commonalities. There are many commonalities in terms of their history, in particular in terms of the history of conquest and the important role that Native groups played in the culture and history of each country. But the emphasis in terms of the kind of culture and the notions of identity that developed in each country are somewhat different. And I think it is fair to say that in Guatemala and in some of the other countries in Central America, but most particularly in Guatemala, the sense of racial and ethnic hierarchy is very, very strong. To be of Spanish descent is to be elite. To be Ladino is to be somewhere in the middle. To be indigenous is to be at the bottom. But the idea that I really want to emphasize, to get back to coffee, is that land was expropriated from both Ladino and Indian peasant villages. Coffee production was concentrated in the highlands. And in both El Salvador and Guatemala, while there were large populations, large peasant villages in the highlands, a lot of population was actually concentrated in the lowlands. So certainly coffee had a big impact on the economy of the highlands in both countries. But it didn't have quite as much of an impact, as dominant as it became, as bananas. One other aspect of coffee that is important and is interesting is that the ownership of coffee plantations tended to stay in Guatemalan and El Salvadoran hands. In other words, the owners of coffee plantations were not foreigners. They were Guatemalans and El Salvadorans. That didn't necessarily make them nicer or better, but it meant that the owners of these enterprises had a connection to the country where the coffee crop was being grown and harvested. Bananas were a different story. Bananas were first introduced into the Caribbean by New England merchants who formed the Boston Fruit Company. As the banana trade grew in conjunction with the growth of railroads in the 19th century along the Central American eastern coast, bananas began to be grown along that coast, again the east coast of Central America, which is lowland territory, and bananas were traded heavily to New Orleans, among other places. And in New Orleans, the Tropical Trading and Transport Company developed. In 1899, the Boston Fruit Company and the Tropical Trading and Transport Company merged. And they became a company that was very important in Central American and Latin American history, and is still very important in Central America and Latin American history, and that was, as it was known then, the United Fruit Company. Central Americans referred to the United Fruit Company as La Frutera. And I think that's a kind of interesting word, too, or term. It's an interesting term because it gives some idea of the power that United Fruit Company held politically, economically, and socially as well. The reason I can say that United Fruit Company still is important today, and you probably know it, is because while the name has changed, it still produces lots of fruit in Central America and other parts of Latin America, and it still plays an important political and economic role. Today, the United Fruit Company is known as Chiquita, and when you're buying Chiquita bananas, they probably were produced in Central or other parts of Latin America. And Chiquita has recently been in the news. If you follow news about Latin America, you might know that they've been in the news because they've been accused of interacting economically with paramilitary, very right-wing forces in Colombia. And if you know anything about the situation in Colombia, you know that it is very tense, very militarized, often on the brink of outright civil war over political issues that have not been solved during the entire second half of the 20th century. And it is interesting that Chiquita in its current form still is involved in politics and the economics of Latin America in some very important ways. The United Fruit Company in 19th and early 20th century Latin America owned railways, ships, docks, ports, and they created what are known as enclave economies par excellence. To quickly define what an enclave economy is, an enclave economy is a section or sector of a national economy completely devoted to a particular crop, often with ownership of the means of production of that crop by one particularly powerful company. And of course, the United Fruit Company and the growth of bananas fits the situation perfectly. Local indigenous and Ladino workers grew bananas and performed other kinds of work for United Fruit Company. The company brought African-descended workers from Jamaica and Spanish-speaking parts of the Caribbean to Central America in order to reinforce and increase the size of the workforce. As they did that, they altered the ethnic and racial composition of the eastern Central American lowlands. So we're talking about major ownership of the means of production by United Fruit Company, because not only do they own railways, ships, and the other things that I mentioned in relation to shipping and movement of produce, United Fruit Company owned and or controlled millions of acres of land. Not only did they own millions of acres of land, some of that land they held in reserve. You can imagine that kind of ownership would create a fair amount of resentment, especially from people from whom land had been taken, because then they have to be in their communities struggling with the economic consequences of land loss and seeing the company hold land in reserve, which it holds in reserve in case of hurricanes or plant disease, and they're doing that so people like me can have bananas with my cereal in the morning. Throughout the 1930s, coffee and bananas accounted for about 75% of Central America's exports. In 1960, the figure was about 67%. Today, there is a lot more diversity in Central American economies. Tourism and textiles in particular play an important role. Nonetheless, coffee and bananas still account for a large number of exports, a large amount of export production. And the concentration, especially in the first half of the 20th century, on these two crops had a number of important consequences. for Central American economies. I think it's probably pretty easy to think of what some of the consequences might be. What might be some things that would be characteristics of the region as a result of the role of the United Fruit Company and one company, and let's just look at bananas, playing such an important role in terms of export production. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Adrian.
If all the bananas caught some kind of fungus or something and all died out, then their economy would suffer?
Yeah, that's really good. That if anything happens to the crop from a fungus or anything else, a hurricane, there are going to be big problems for the economy, not just of one country, but several countries in the region, and really big problems. So overdependence on a single crop carries with it serious risk. Yeah.
That's kind of like the potato famine in Ireland. They were dependent on one crop.
Exactly. That's a good point. And we know what that can lead to, and one of the things it can lead to is immigration. Another consequence of over-reliance on a single crop, and a single crop that has to be produced in a very labor-intensive way, is that the company has to have a lot of control over labor. And this is not a kind of labor that is going to lead to social mobility. If you grow up growing and picking bananas, when you're an older person, you might very well be doing the same thing. So it doesn't lead to mobility on the micro level, that is, in terms of the individual person or family, and it doesn't really lead to the development of the economy. And when the economy doesn't develop, the consequence of that is that there is little to no industrialization. And in an increasingly industrial world, that increasingly leads to Central America and some of its largest countries, in and of themselves, being enclave economies. It's not just that there are sectors of the economy, but the whole economy, in a sense, is an enclave economy. While the countries of Central America began from the mid-20th century on to attempt to industrialize, agricultural production remained protected, and economies, even in the era of ISI or import substitution industrialization, even in the era where ISI was promoted, Central American economies remained focused on agriculture. Economies remained primarily agricultural, and populations remained largely rural, which meant that the patterns of urbanization that were occurring elsewhere in Latin America did not occur to the same degree in Central America. Annual per capita incomes remained very low. Levels of education, literacy, and health indicators all remained low. Such conditions exerted enormous political and social pressure on the region's governments. Because on the one hand, you have companies like the United Fruit Company who profit from this situation, so they pressure the governments to maintain this kind of agricultural production and specialization. On the other hand, you have rural people who are increasingly aware, self-conscious of the circumstances in which they live. They know that elsewhere in Latin America, let alone in the developed world, they know elsewhere in Latin America, in at least some parts of Latin America, change is occurring and more economic development is taking place, and they aren't participating in it. In Guatemala, which is what I want to focus on in terms of more recent political history, in response to this tension between an economic structure which companies, the U.S. government, and Guatemalan elites all have a stake in, yet the people of Guatemala have an ambivalence about. The consequence of the tension between these two forces meant that Guatemala has had a long history of caudillo rule and military rule. In the 19th century, whether liberal or conservative, strong men dominated. In 1944 into the early 1950s, for that brief amount of time, beginning with something called the October Revolution, this began to change. The October Revolution brought open elections in 1945, and in 1945, Juan José Arevalo Bermejo was elected president. He was an idealist. He believed in socialism, a very mild form of socialism. He wasn't a communist, but he believed in a mild form of socialism, that is redistribution of wealth. And he encouraged the writing of a more democratic constitution. He promoted worker organization. And he tried to build a stronger system of public education. So he believed in some forms of economic and social development. He was in office for 5 years, and in 5 years he experienced and had to endure some 25 military revolts from the Guatemalan military. In 1950, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, the defense minister under Arevalo, was elected. Arbenz himself was a reformer. He didn't even call himself a socialist. He was, however, supported by the Guatemalan Communist Party, a fact which made Guatemalan elites, the United Fruit Company, and the U.S. government deeply, deeply suspicious of him. Arbenz embarked on policies of economic expansion. He was able to pass the first income tax in Guatemala's history. But the most important and most threatening part of his policies was his devotion to the idea of agrarian reform and land redistribution. The Guatemalan Congress in 1952 passed a law expropriating only uncultivated parts of large plantations. Remember, I said that United Fruit Company, for example, held land in reserve. So we're talking about uncultivated land held in reserve. The expropriations allowed 1,700 acres, for example, that were owned by Arbenz himself to be expropriated. But this was of little importance. That is, that he himself was giving up land. This was of little importance to the U.S. or the United Fruit Company. The Eisenhower administration undertook a campaign to destabilize Arbenz's government, and after creating a variety of pressures and operating through the OAS, or Organization of American States, the CIA bankrolled an exile invasion. This might sound familiar. The CIA bankrolled an exile invasion, and Arbenz stepped down just as planes associated with the exile group began to attack Guatemala City. Latin American nations were horrified. They protested this intervention. Yet the U.S. went forward, supporting the presidency of Carlos Castillo Armas, who ruled undemocratically, and in favor of coffee elites and the United Fruit Company. A series of strongmen then held the presidency, and beginning in the late 1950s, a whole line of right-wing military governments held power. This went on for about 30 years. In 1982, power was seized by General Efraín Ríos Montt, who was at that moment actually a retired army officer and born-again evangelical Christian. And that fact is both interesting and important because Ríos Montt's power allowed evangelical Christians to come into Guatemala in larger numbers and play a role in converting Guatemalans, some of them at least, from Catholicism to various forms of Protestantism. The growing revolt against military rule, however, which had already exploded into civil war in the mid-1970s, became more desperate in the period of time that Ríos Montt and his military successors ruled, and the circumstances of war changed dramatically. What happened? From approximately 1975 to 1985, the Guatemalan military, in league with paramilitary death squads, conducted a war against members of left-wing guerrilla fighting units, leftist political parties, union members, and most importantly, they took the war to the country's rural indigenous population. Military forces believed, as did their leaders, that Indians were natural, that they were a sort of natural left constituency, that they were leftists in sympathy with political leftists, communists and others. And what was important about Ríos Montt and the period that he governed and those that followed him was that he and those who served under him conducted a particularly vicious campaign against Maya communities, seeing them, as I said, as leftist sympathizers, as traitors. Whole villages were exterminated. Thousands and thousands of people died. Civil defense patrols consisting of men, often from indigenous communities, recruited from indigenous communities, were created in this period to control and fight against the villages and communities in their regions. Ultimately, at least 200,000 people died during the period of the Guatemalan Civil War. And it really was literally as if the country was torn in two and fought against itself. What is, I think, of significance about this, and there are a lot of things that are significant about it. Unfortunately, we can't talk about it in as much detail as the topic deserves. But among the things that are significant about the Guatemalan Civil War, I think, are that, first, there certainly were significant political issues that underlie the struggle. And in a certain way, they go back to that liberal conservative struggle of the 19th century. They go back to the different visions of the country as more colonial and hierarchical or more modern and developed. And the fact that conservative dictators dominated for a long time and were able to control the politics meant that the population remained organized in a racially and ethnically hierarchical way that would lead, in a certain sense, to the other aspect that is so important in understanding this war, and that is that it was a war about race and ethnic identity. In 1996, a peace accord was finally negotiated. Fighting had largely stopped by the late 1980s. In the 1990s, Guatemalan political parties and social groups struggled towards a peace accord. It was finally signed. And then the country started to struggle with the aftermath. What was the aftermath? What was the meaning of this terrible set of events? And as you know from studying American history, a civil war is a terrible thing. We know it as we read the newspaper every day, and we see civil wars in several parts of the world, but we know it from our own history as well. It leaves lasting scars. And the attempt to understand the meaning of all the events that are part of a civil war that goes along with living through the aftermath, it is not something easy, and it certainly wasn't in Guatemala. And an example of how and why it wasn't is that Bishop Juan Jose Girardi, who oversaw the writing of a vast report known as the REMHI, Recovery of Historical Memory Report, which was a report that tried to deal factually with what happened. It has authoritative figures, who died, how many died, how they died. He was murdered under very strange circumstances just days after that report was released. In a lot of ways, Guatemala and the other governments of Central America have made real progress. Right now, all the governments are democratically elected. Most govern from the right, though the recent election of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua returns a leftist to power, but Ortega has said that it is his intention to rule from the center. Nonetheless, most people remain poor. Economic development plans like CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, remain untested as a means of developing Central American economies. Violence, drug trafficking, and money laundering remain significant problems. In Guatemala, violence and lawlessness remains a particular problem. Political violence remains a particular problem. At the same time as there is democracy, yet significant problems remain, Guatemala also still grapples with the nature of its identity and the identity of its people. And as I talk about gender, I'll come back to Guatemala and talk about some of the consequences of the Civil War, and one woman in particular, Rigoberta Menchú, who came out of the Civil War period as a social activist, who played a very important role both during and after the Civil War period, who won the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize. But before I talk about Menchú, I do want to turn to the issue of gender and the history of gender roles in Latin America. This is a huge topic. At the moment, I have about 30 minutes left. I won't be able to talk about every aspect of this, so I'll get through what I can get through and pick it up again when there is time for me to talk about these issues in the coming weeks before the end of the semester. But I do want to talk about gender and the importance of gender history. Just to say a couple of comments before I get into the whole issue of gender history and women's history in Latin America. Historians in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s began to turn towards what we refer to as social history, the study of different kinds of social groups that had not previously been studied very much by historians, and women's history was a major part of that. What's interesting about women's history, and I think one of the almost funny ironies of it, is that as women's historians turn to documenting the role of women throughout history in every part of the world, in every time period, we figured out that you really can't understand the role of women without understanding the history of men, because the definition of female roles and the definition of male roles, those two things are always in relationship to each other. So what that means is that historians began to focus more not just on women, but on men, on gender roles, on sexuality, sexual identity. And there are just so many interesting questions that relate to all those issues, and certainly historians of Latin America have been focused on looking at all these different aspects of gender history, which I can't possibly forget about in the rest of the time I have today. I couldn't possibly talk about them in the weeks that we have left in the semester. My particular focus in the study of gender, because that is one of the areas in my own work that I'm most interested in, my particular focus has had to do with women and recovering women's history. It is very hard to generalize because of the different ethnic, religious, and cultural differences across Latin America, and then of course we have the whole issue of the fact that there are different national histories that came into play beginning in the early 19th century. Nonetheless, there are a few generalizations to describe some of the history of women as a way of introducing the history of indigenous women, which is what I most want to focus on. There are some generalizations that I do want to remark upon in order to help us get to the issue of indigenous women and be able to look at that in a little bit more detail. Point number one, indigenous societies in the past, and here I'm talking really about the pre-Hispanic past, indigenous societies often were more egalitarian. Second point, colonization and Spanish colonialism either reinforced or brought new ideas of gender inequality, which were strongly reinforced by the colonial Catholic Church. In Spanish society, women were subordinated. In the Catholic Church, their role was and remains in certain ways secondary. So I do have to make one really quick point about Spanish gender roles in the colonial period, and that is that the Spanish inheritance system was quite different from that of the British. In the Spanish system, you have what's called bilateral inheritance, and in a bilateral inheritance system, women can inherit property and they can own it in their own names. And that is one way in which gender roles in Spain and ultimately in Latin America do differ from the British colonies and later early U.S. So I would say Spanish women were not quite as subordinated as the English women who came to the American colonies. Be that as it may, Spanish colonization did bring some new ideas about gender inequality. And as the new nation states of Latin America developed political systems and wrote legal codes, they wrote legal codes that expressed gender hierarchy. And that's the third point, that as nation states formed, the hierarchy that had become more rigid during the colonial period became even more so in the 19th and in much of the 20th centuries. As I pointed out, however, there were and are many different groups of women in Latin America, as there are throughout the world. There are elite women, there are middle class, poorer women, so there are class differences. There are and were Spanish women, women of African identity or descent, indigenous women, mixed race women, there were nuns and other religious women. Women could be married, they were often actually unmarried. Women were often thought of in stereotypical terms as either the good mother or the bad woman. That is, in Latin American culture, I think it was pretty common to see women in terms of their image as falling into one of these groups and defined by these two extreme ways of defining women's image and identity. Reality, of course, is more complex, and women's history certainly teaches overall that Latin American women have often been extremely productive and politically active. What I want to focus on in my comments about women, I want to focus on the history of indigenous women, and I want to talk about that thematically. That is, by asking what are some ways that we can understand indigenous women's history and experiences. I will look at this briefly in terms of the past, but I want to look at it in greater detail in terms of the more recent past and present, that is, the roles of women in the 20th and early 21st century, the roles of indigenous women in the 20th and early 21st centuries, and I want to look in particular at Mesoamerica and look at Nahua women and Maya women. But before I do that, there are some themes or ideas for looking at indigenous women that are important for us to think about. One of the most important points I could make about the history of Native women in Latin America is that this is a history that has been marked by both continuities and discontinuities. In other words, It's a history of lots of change, but also a history with some continuity. In terms of looking at both continuity and change, it's useful to look at women's roles in terms first of the long history of contributing productive and reproductive labor that they have, that is, contributing productive and reproductive labor to their families and communities, the often hidden role they've played in both political organization and activism for change, and the central roles they have played in family and kinship structures, especially in times of change and transformation where men, women, and children have to contend with rapidly shifting political and economic circumstances. And they often do so by making use of strategies that are not simply individual, but are familial and communal at the same time. In looking at the ancient past, as I alluded to before, there's no doubt that indigenous women had and have subordinate roles in their societies, but archaeologists certainly can show that many native Latin American societies, especially in the period before the rise not just of urbanism but of empires, so in the period prior to about 300 BCE, before the Common Era, many native Latin American societies were relatively egalitarian in their social, religious, and even political structures. Yet a history that focused only on women's subordination would be very incomplete because it would ignore the hidden roles of authority that women have played within and beyond their families and communities. So it is important to talk about women's agency. Agency is a really important concept that historians have used, social and cultural historians have used, to understand the history of all these different groups that have been subordinated in a variety of ways, yet still find a way to act upon the world. And acting upon the world, in a sense, is the best definition of agency. Acting upon the world to survive, that is, to reproduce the conditions that you need to live your everyday life. But of course, acting upon the world can be something far beyond surviving. Acting upon the world can mean becoming a revolutionary. So agency has at least two senses. There are at least two faces or two aspects of it that are important to think about and that are useful in thinking about women's history. First, agency can refer to everyday actions that produce and reproduce life and living. When I talk about reproducing life and living, I'm not just talking about reproduction in the sense of having babies. I'm talking about reproduction in the sense of the things that we do every day to make sure that when we wake up tomorrow, our kids, our significant others, maybe our parents, other relatives, that we all have what we need to keep going. So I mean reproduction and production in this sort of general sense. And that takes some agency. You have to be able to act upon the world. You can't be sitting in isolation in prison and really reproducing life. Somebody else is probably doing it for you under those circumstances. You're not doing it for yourself. So there's an everyday aspect of agency, but there's also a sense of agency as taking power. Agency as acting to influence others, to influence other people, to influence events, to create events, to defend one's culture and society, to change one's culture and society. Agency in this more active sense. There are a lot of different aspects of it. As I talk about the history of indigenous women, without denying the forms of subjugation that they often experienced, and I will mention some of that, I want to emphasize their history as a history of women's agency. Their history of labor, their history of familial activity, that is, activity within their family realms, that's useful and important in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about some of that. And I also want to talk about them as political actors, that is, that women took political action in the past and in the present. It is important, as I've already noted, however, to acknowledge that both anthropologists and historians continue to find evidence of gender asymmetry, with women usually in the lower status in relation to men, not just in Latin American indigenous societies, but in many of the world's societies, past and present. But we can't assume that gender asymmetry or hierarchy is universal. And social scientists and scientists have never been able to find a single cause or reason that explains the presence of asymmetry. There's no biological explanation that explains it fully. There's no economic explanation. There's no ideological or psychological explanation. I think gender asymmetry comes about and takes many different forms for a lot of different reasons. Nonetheless, asymmetry does exist, and it is something that we need to talk about when we look at indigenous women's roles. But as I've said, these ideas of work, family and kinship, and politics are important in understanding indigenous women's experiences. They have a long history of performing not just reproductive, but productive labor. This was true in the earlier past, the more distant past, pre-Hispanic period, colonial period, true in the 19th and 20th century, and it's true today as well. What's interesting about looking at women today is that indigenous women, as I would argue women everywhere in the globe, are increasingly experiencing the impact of globalization. Worldwide, more women than ever before perform paid labor. Much of the growth in women's employment, especially factory employment, has in fact occurred in Latin America. It's occurred in two parts of the world, in particular in Latin America and Asia. And before I talk more about economic change as a context in which we need to, as a context that we need to look at in order to understand the experiences of indigenous women generally, I do want to come back to the concept of globalization, because globalization is very important. We have talked about structural reform, we have talked about neoliberalism, but we haven't really talked a whole lot about the concept of globalization. Structural reform and neoliberalism are related in fundamental ways to globalization. Globalization can be understood more narrowly as actually as a very simple set of changes which can be summarized by talking about the increasing economic integration of the world's economies. Again, globalization can be understood as the increasing economic integration of the world's economies. That's a pretty simple idea, and I hope all of you know what I'm talking about, because I think we're living it every day. There's hardly anything we use that is produced 100% in the U.S. And we know that we are producing things that are going elsewhere in the globe, especially we're producing culture that's having a really big, popular culture, that's having a really big impact on the rest of the world. Britney Spears doesn't just make news in the U.S. She's followed in Latin America, in Europe, in many different parts of the world where you wouldn't think teenagers really would be worrying about Britney Spears. But that gets at the other part of globalization that I think is important. And when we look at globalization in terms of any group, particular group, when we look at globalization, globalization is also a cultural phenomenon. So it has these two sides. It's about economic integration, it's about cultural integration, but it's also about resistance to those kinds of transformations. So getting back to the broader context of globalization and women's labor. As I said, more women worldwide than ever before are performing paid labor. A lot of that is factory employment, not all of it, but a lot of it is, and much of it has occurred in Latin America and Asia. Yet waged employment is only part of the story of economic change for women, especially indigenous women. Even if women do not perform wage labor, they may take on traditionally male tasks because of male out-migration. And we all know also that migration is a very major topic in the contemporary world, not just in our own country and in our own political system, but in many countries and in many parts of the world. And just as the immigration of large number of people coming here has a big impact on us, out-migration and outflows of people have a huge impact, a tremendous impact also, on the countries and people who stay behind. And one of the consequences of lots of men leaving, though it's also the case that the gender makeup of flows of migrants has also changed, but I won't be able to talk about that right now. Large numbers of men leaving to perform migrant labor in other regions or other countries has a lot of consequences on the people, especially women left behind. What happens? They take on traditionally male tasks. They intensify aspects of traditional female productive roles. They may start to do in larger numbers and spend more hours of the day in craft production to earn cash, to pay for goods that male heads of household formerly did. And women themselves may end up migrating, because sometimes there are circumstances in communities where so many men have migrated, sometimes women's circumstances become untenable. So women themselves may migrate. Some of the women cleaning houses and caring for children in Houston are indigenous. They might be Maya, they might be Nahuas, they might be Quechua speakers from Ecuador, Peru, or Bolivia. But the women who come from other countries and clean houses and care for children are part of what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild has referred to as the global care chain. And some of these women in Houston and other communities throughout the United States do come from indigenous backgrounds and communities. The increased workload borne by Latin American and other women has had a very heavy impact on their lives. When I say that the increased workload of women has had a heavy impact on their lives, it is important to realize, and I do want to point out, I am not comparing women's labor to men's labor in that statement. In other words, I'm not saying that women are working harder than men. I'm not necessarily saying that. What I'm saying is that women's labor has intensified over time. They work harder than they did in the past. In addition to the greater time spent working, whatever small increases in autonomy for wage-earning women that occur tend to be outweighed by the subordination that women often experience in workplaces that use gender hierarchy to keep women's wages low and to control their potential workplace activism. In addition, male attitudes in homes and communities increasingly define and denigrate work like craft production as housework rather than productive labor. So, as we know, the world's a complicated place, and two different things can go on. Women can work more, they can earn more money, but it might not necessarily lead to an improvement of their status. And what does change gender status in terms of women and men and their relationships with each other that's a complicated question. These kinds of changes are frequently accompanied by increasing destabilization of family life. As women begin to work more, domestic violence, alcoholism, and single-parent households, usually headed by women, become more common. This is the context of globalization and change in women's work patterns that indigenous women have dealt with in Latin American history. Another context, another important theme, does have to do with women's political roles and activism. We can chronicle a history of women playing important political roles in indigenous societies from the pre-Hispanic period to the present. That is not a continuous history. In other words, women's political roles have changed. Of course, it sounds beyond obvious to point out that as political systems have changed, women's and men's roles in those political systems have changed as well. What's important about talking about women's political roles is that's often what I would call a hidden history. And it's hidden in a number of ways. Women's political activism is often not chronicled very much as part of the historical record, so it's hard to find out about it. And it takes some work and digging to do that. But it's hidden in another way. Historians who have tried to study this question have found that, for example, when using the technique of oral history, just talking to people about their recent history and what people have done, women's activism is often forgotten, downplayed, or denigrated. Sometimes by men, sometimes by women. Because that activism, which I would argue is often a part of women's roles in history, it's a sort of often a normal part of their roles, not always, but often, is at the same time in conflict with a more hierarchical, maybe even patriarchal definition of gender roles that says that men are in the dominant legal and political position. I think the idea of women not playing important political roles really became institutionalized in Latin America for indigenous women certainly, but other women as well, in the 19th century, as constitutions were written, as legal codes were developed that reinforced gender hierarchy. But in the 20th century, especially the late 20th and early 21st centuries, real change has taken place. Globalization has hurt women economically in a lot of ways, I would argue, but paradoxically, and I think Rigoberta Menchú, as I'll talk about when I have a chance to, I think Rigoberta Menchú is actually a good example of the way that paradoxically globalization has actually enhanced in certain ways women's political activism, power, and their ability to voice agendas of change. Voice and image are two other themes that I think are important in understanding women's roles in the past and indigenous women's roles in particular. One of the things that indigenous women in the contemporary period have begun to do is to create their own historical record. Maya women in particular have been very active in doing that. And when I'm able to talk specifically about the history, the more recent history of Nahua women, women who are part of groups that are the descendants of the Aztecs, who we talked about earlier in the semester, when I can talk in more detail about Nahua women and Maya women, I'll use these themes of work, family, politics, activism, voice, image as a way to talk about the activities and history of women. And we need to